Thank you very much, Professor Nelson, for joining us and agreeing to come on. We're excited to have a little bit of a talk with you. Just as a little reminder, we have a number of programs that we run, but one that is specifically tailored for a lot of your work that you do is the Nitzavim Fellowship. The Nitzavim Fellowship is a program that takes students that are here in Israel for a gap year and giving them the tools and the resources and the confidence and the excitement that when they go and embark on their college career around the United States, also in Canada, as well as we have a few students that go to the UK, that give them the confidence to stand up to anti-Semitism, anti-Israel sentiments, and not only not be scared, but actually to hopefully make a difference around the world. We're very excited to have you, especially since this is something that you have been working on for now over 40 years. Why did you get drawn to the concept of anti-Semitism, and how has it changed over the past 40 years that you've been involved in this research and understanding?
First, let me say, I think that your program is really important. There's no question that spending time in Israel is the single most productive thing that students can do. It's perhaps the only thing that I think can build long-term Zionist resilience, that is long-term strength and conviction about Zionism, and the ability to resist the pressures and the threats which really have increased in not only in the last few years, but of course, since 10/7 have escalated in really an astonishing and unprecedented way. So I think spending time in Israel, and especially on an organized program, is even more important than I would have said it was a few years ago. What drew me to this? I grew up in a Jewish household. We weren't observant, Reform Jews, but we were active. My father actually started 2 synagogues in Bucks County, which was a very rural area outside Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, quite rural, fields and streams. And first 8 years of my life, I was in Philadelphia. I went to an elementary school where there were a lot of Jewish kids. Then when we went to the rural area in Pennsylvania, there really weren't any at first. And that was my first encounters with anti-Semitism. A certain amount of getting beaten up on the playground in 3rd grade. I was completely astonished when I first went to class that we were in a public school assigned to study the New Testament and to take quizzes about the New Testament. Even though I was still young, it wasn't what I expected in a public school. So I sort of learned about these things. And then in a few years, more people moved to the area, and there was enough people to actually start a synagogue. My father was the president of the synagogue. I got very close to the young rabbi that we had. He was actually still a student rabbi, a guy named Jim Rudin, who later became an authority on interfaith relations in the United States and Europe. I taught Hebrew school on Sunday as a teenager when I was there, collected some money for Israel in those little blue boxes that we had. So those elements of my past were really established very early on. But then when I went to college, I no longer encountered anti-Semitism. I simply did not have, in the 4 years of college, a single contact with anti-Semitism. And as the 60s continued, of course, for the most part, Israel was still an admired country in the United States. Even after the 67 war, when hostility to Israel on the left began, it was still a very much confined phenomenon. I didn't really begin to see anti-Semitism in the university until much later. And then, of course, in the new millennium, the boycott campaign started in 2001. It started both in Britain and in the United States. And then I became conscious of the new anti-Semitism. In one level, how did I get started? There really wasn't any choice, not just because of my background, but when I was in high school in the late 50s and early 60s, we were going to progressive events. The name Norman Thomas might not mean too much in Israel, but he was the socialist candidate for president of the United States for many years. Incredibly powerful speaker. In high school, I heard him not in the high school, but in the area. I heard him talk 3 times. I heard Bayard Rustin talk twice. He was actually the organizer of the '63 March in Washington for racial justice. My family drove down to Washington for that march. I was there on the Mall to hear Martin Luther King give his I Have a Dream speech. Now, those events weren't about Israel, but they accustomed me to speaking out. If there was a problem, if there was an issue, you got up and you took a stand about it. By the time, as a faculty member, I encountered anti-Semitism in the academy, beginning in 2001, the idea that I would encounter something that I despised and that I wouldn't stand up about it really wasn't a question. It wasn't a question of courage. It was the natural thing to do, although I certainly ran into a lot of other people who were fearful. In 2006 to 7 was the first time that the Modern Language Association, which is the professional faculty association for people in literature and foreign languages, faced an academic boycott resolution. And there were about 8 or 10 of us at the back of a meeting standing around, and everyone was saying, someone needs to get up and speak up. And everyone said, oh, I'm afraid I'm not going to do it. I'm going to do it. And I said, geez, just get up and speak out. What's the problem? I'll get up and do it.
This seems to a common theme, and I would love to just jump in. What is the big fear that everybody has to speak up, especially amongst the academicians in the professorial world?
I think more than anything else, it's the fear of social ostracism. They fear being shunned. They feel being cut out of progressive organizations. They feel being shunned by their colleagues. And that will happen. It's not an irrational fear. It's a perfectly rational one. And I think, if anything, it's become worse. On the front of fighting BDS in the academy, across the US for several years, I was it. I was alone doing it, very conscious of that. And then after a few years, additional people began doing it. But I used to get lots of insulting emails and statements on the web that were aggressive. I never faced any physical threats, but I certainly faced a lot of nastiness, and it wasn't pleasant, but you just have to deal with it.
So along those lines, there's a value that you believe in terms of standing up and fighting BDS. And if you were the only one doing it for so long until other people jumped on board, how did you have the personal resolve to continue on your mission and not get burnt out by all the negative emails and negative sentiments that you were receiving?
I think part of it is that I don't believe in giving up. If I take on something I believe in, I stay with it for at least as long until I feel there's nothing more useful that I can do. But I've also always tried to put a practical question on the table for myself, which is not what are the long-term accomplishments that I can make, but what can I do tomorrow? When I get up tomorrow morning, what practical thing can I do? And I actually often ask when I'm about to go to bed, I think, tomorrow the first thing I'll do is this, because you can't guarantee that you will be successful. You can't be confident about the impact that you will have. You can certainly be confident about the problems that continue. Anti-Semitism, if we haven't gotten rid of it in 3,000 years, we're probably not going to eliminate it tomorrow. That's going to be there. You're one human being. What are your skills? What are your talents? What can you do about it? And so if you ask that question, you can put the next foot forward.
What do you think changed after October 7th? And I'll break this down to two questions, is for the general populace, but then even more so on college campuses where it just became out of control. What changed, and maybe what was percolating beforehand that this was the impetus to then erupt?
There's no possibility of explaining the wave of anti-Semitism that swept the Western world immediately after October 7th. One certainly knew each time that Israel has faced a war with Hamas, any sympathy that exists for Israel on the international front is pretty soon replaced by hostility. So you could have predicted that. What we could not have predicted and didn't predict was that The surge of hostility occurred within hours. There were faculty members in the US who wrote about the wonderful attack that Hamas carried out, and they published this stuff on October 8th. In other words, they heard about it on October 7th. By the time we woke up here in the US, of course, events were already unfolding in Israel. It's 8 hours ahead of time. And so people joined the hostility instantly. There's no way that could have happened unless a reserve of anti-Semitism was deeply embedded and widespread already. You don't develop anti-Semitism in an hour, let alone in minutes. So that reserve had to be there. I don't think we understood its depth. I don't think we understood its passion, but we learned something about its passion rather quickly because of what our nastiest colleagues and students began to say, literally as the day unfolded. Each time there has been a war with Hamas, the level of hostility toward Israel increases. And what you might call the baseline of hostility is raised. There have been more specific aggressive activities that have been added to the list, and there's been an increased level of hostility. And I think what we saw this time, in addition to everything else, was a base level of hate, a hostility that really crossed a line from any kind of political antagonism into something more visceral. And I think it has to be called hatred. That's going to be with us for a while. I don't know how long it's going to be with us, but it's going to be with us all this year. It's going to be with us next year. And it's one of the things people, I think, have to be prepared for. Students going off to many of our strong universities here in Europe and in Britain have to be prepared for a more visceral encounter with hatred than they would have been even 2 years ago. The encampments that started in the US, started at Columbia University, spread across the United States, spread into Canada, spread into Britain, and then spread scattered cases around the world, in Brazil, in Japan, in countries, Western countries and other areas throughout the world, they spread. And I'm still astonished. The first encampments were in mid to late April in the United States, and by early May, they had spread around the world. I don't think any of us have seen a surge in anti-Semitism that became global so quickly before. We never saw anything like that in the past.
It's fairly unfathomable that universities, especially at the most prestigious of institutions coming from Western society, which are supposed to be a beacon of intellectual honesty and moral clarity, how can it be, from your perspective, that when things are so clearly documented, shown exactly what happened, that you could have these institutions and people in the institutions that are supposed to be so-called the moral beacons, how can they be the ones that are logically giving some form of rationale? Is there any logical rationale that you've heard from all different professors or students that seem to make any sense, as opposed to just saying this is anti-Semitism and therefore it's visceral and emotional and not intellectually honest?
One of the frequently depressing facts of fighting anti-Semitism in higher education is that it's very hard to get any purchase for facts. That is, it's very hard to get an audience for information, for rational argument. You still do those things, but I often say you're doing them so that people with Zionist sympathies can have the rational arguments that they need to have in debates. You're helping to educate the people who are sympathetic. But trying to get an audience amongst your opponents for rationality is really quite a challenge, and it's not getting any easier. There's no single explanation for why that change has occurred in the academy. It's true that it's become more acceptable over 30 years for faculty members to do more political advocacy in the classroom. I used to think that was fine because I thought faculty members would model rational political arguments. That is, that they would show how you pursued a political argument with evidence. And when I was president of the AUP, I said, yes, if you were rational, if you showed the value of evidence, if you invited and welcomed alternative opinion. I used to let my own politics be clear, and I would tell my students, my undergraduates, if you do a good job of disagreeing with me, I give you extra credit. Because I wasn't interested in students parroting what I wanted to say. I wanted a good discussion. I wanted them to prove themselves capable of disagreeing with me. But once faculty members become convinced that they possess the absolute truth, then they're not interested in alternative opinions. And so part of what's happened, and it's taken a generation, is that some academic disciplines have become corrupted by convictions. They're no longer interested in hearing both sides. They believe that they have absolute truth and they want to promote it to their students. So there are a series of disciplines that have become corrupted. And when those disciplines become corrupted, the departments that represent them also can turn into indoctrination machines. So much so that they really just become impossible for Zionist students and faculty to participate in those disciplines any longer. They just have to go elsewhere. You're Ruth amidst the alien corn. You just don't want to be in those spaces. But all of that change has been gradual. It didn't take place overnight. The prioritizing of a social justice mission in some areas of the academy, that takes precedence over the search for the truth. That has also helped corrupt academic disciplines. There are many factors, and there's also no silver bullet to cure it.
In all of your research and all spending time on this, have you come to any root of where anti-Semitism stems from and why it's come about, why it keeps on coming about?
Obviously, it's been with us for just a tad longer than I've been on the earth. It hasn't gone away for several thousand years. It won't go away. If you study anti-Semitism, you are surprised by how successfully it has mutated over the centuries. The religious anti-Semitism grounded in Christian faith that produced so many pogroms and so many exiles of Jewish populations in Europe over the centuries, gradually in the 19th century became a reactive anti-Semitism as the Enlightenment progressed and as Jews began to have more civil rights, often not political rights, but at least civil rights in the 19th century. Many European movements arose to oppose those rights for Jews. In the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, Jews weren't getting rights, really. They were tolerated in some cases, but they weren't given the right to really participate in social life in the same way. As general philosophies about human freedom progressed and Jews began to get some of those social rights, there was a reaction against it. And so anti-Semitism mutated, it changed. And then in the late 19th century, a really racial anti-Semitism arose. There hadn't been a racial anti-Semitism before. There hadn't been the delusion that Jews were somehow racially distinct and racially undesirable. Of course, that triumphed in Germany under Nazism a few decades later, but it began in the late 19th century. So anti-Semitism has had great staying power. It's been able to adapt to the fears that populations had, and as those fears evolved over time. It's had some continuities. For example, even though different conspiracy theories were at stake in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the Enlightenment in Europe and in the 20th century, there were nonetheless conspiracy theories. A newer conspiracy theory would replace an older conspiracy theory. Anti-Semitism, therefore, would adopt. And of course, until the Jewish state was founded in 48, there was no conspiracy theory that Israel was trying to control the world. It was the Jews simply that were trying to control the world. A different version of a conspiracy theory came into place when there was actually a Jewish state to resist. At some level, I think anti-Semitism remains mysterious. It remains something that's beyond understanding. Just as 10-7 was thoroughly beyond understanding. But what would motivate such deep level of hatred, that remains, I think, in a way beyond our understanding. So you have to accept that your understanding of anti-Semitism will always have limits. It will always remain a horror that escapes your complete comprehension, but it adapts.
Definitely an important point. And I want to come back to that at the end, but I do want to shift right now for a second to something practical for our students that are in Israel on this gap year program, Nitzavim, that they're learning the skills, the resolve, the excitement to get to college campus and hopefully be a beacon of light onto their campuses, as well as our alumni that just started this year. What advice would you give to all of these students that have Zionist beliefs, that are passionate about Israel, passionate about Jewish life, and now are finding themselves on all different colleges all over the place? How would you suggest to them to stay excited and passionate? Should they stand up? Should they not stand up? If you had kids going in right now, what would you suggest to them?
Whether you stand up or not really partly depends upon your character and your personality. Not everyone is fit for leadership roles. You have to decide, find out where your strengths are and what you're comfortable doing. But I think for all students who are Zionist, first of all, community is important. If there are groups on campus, whether it's Hillel or Chabad or a local synagogue that has students in it, whatever you can do to be part of a sympathetic, supportive group is terribly important. It's terribly important even if you're isolated as a leader. You don't want to be alone. You want to be amongst others. So I think that's the first thing that's important, is to seek out a community that you can be part of. And then I think, and I say this given that I am at a university, education is critical. If you want to confront anti-Semitism, you need to understand the history of anti-Semitism. You need to understand the arguments that anti-Zionists make. And you need to take courses, you need to study, you need to be in reading groups. I think knowledge does help you stand firm. There's less basis for fear if you think you understand the phenomenon. So I think that is terribly important. And then I think you need to reflect on the fact that Zionism is part of your identity. This is a period of time in college where you're figuring out who you are. You're making decisions about what your life, the rest of your life is going to be. It's a period when you're exploring and trying to establish what your future is. And I think it's good to think about what role Zionism is going to play in your life, not just while you're in college, but for your future. What kind of commitment is this going to be? And I certainly think it helps to spend some time in Israel if you can, in your program or another program like it. For me, it was the visits that I've made to Israel have been absolutely critical in coming to understand more than Israel as an abstraction. I don't think there were those programs back in the late 50s and early 60s, or at least I was certainly unaware of it as an option. So it's great that option is there for people these today. So I think that's also important. Is there going to be some time when you're in college to go there, to meet Israelis, to talk with them, to travel, to see the country? Just to see Jerusalem makes a difference, I think, in being able to stand your ground.
In terms of that educational component that you mentioned, are there one or two or three important pieces of literature or books that you recommend is paramount for students that are Zionists, that care about Israel, care about Jewish life, that are important that everybody needs to know about and read?
I don't think there are one or two books. I'm reading a new book every week on Zionism. My house is full of them. You can hardly make it from room to room for the piles of books and papers. So making a really short list is impossible. Of my own books, I think the two that are most essential, the first one would be Israel Denial, which is a study of anti-Zionist faculty and the arguments that they make. And it's a really deep dive into anti-Zionism. Nasty stuff, but somebody had to do it. And then the other book is the most recent one called Hate Speech and Academic Freedom, just came out this April. And in that book, I'm trying to ask what we can do. What can we do about faculty anti-Semitism? So the first book describes the problem. The second book offers a bunch of solutions. And then I think it's a matter of finding where your interests lie. Maybe you want to read something about the history of anti-Semitism in Christianity. Maybe you want to read something about Israeli history. Frankly, I think what you need to do is to read a bunch of books, not just one or two. You need to keep exploring different elements of the issues that are often treated very separately in different books. I wrote a book called Not in Kansas Anymore, Academic Freedom in Palestinian Universities. So it was an entire book mostly about the lack of freedom in Palestinian universities and showing that there wasn't Israel that compromised academic freedom. It was the Palestinians themselves that had no patience or tolerance for it. So that was a very specific topic. And I think a lot of books really explore something very particular, the history of Israel, the history of anti-Semitism in Europe, et cetera, et cetera.
Sounds like the list is endless, but thank you for giving us a few, especially your books that seem very exciting that we'll hopefully recommend to the students. In terms of shifting a little bit just to parents before we close out, is when parents are helping guide their children right now, balancing academia as well as values. How would you, at this point in time, where we are post October 7th, how would you recommend to parents to figure out which university students should go to? The challenges of anti-Semitism, should that factor into people's decisions right now of where they are going to enroll in college or not, from your perspective, dealing with professors and seeing things from behind the scenes?
I don't blame people for feeling that they were thinking of going to Columbia, they were thinking of going to Harvard, but maybe they don't want to go there. Maybe the anti-Semitic character of some of the prestige institutions mean that's not the best choice. Of course, if all Jews decide that, then those distinguished universities become Judenrein, to use the Nazi term, Jew-free institutions. And that's a terrible result, that Jews simply bail from those places. One hopes that people will still have the courage to go there and to put pressure on those institutions to change. And I think pressure can come from parents. I think it's time for donors and graduates, alumni, to stop donating money to universities unless the universities adopt rigorous programs to educate students and faculty about anti-Semitism. I think your gift should be conditional upon institutions starting to do good work. Stanford University and Columbia University just did really good reports about how the institutions should change, what they need to do. And I think if parents read those reports, before they give money, they should say, what have you done? Have you adopted these proposals? What are you actually doing to make change at your institutions? Because change is possible. It's not just an abstract problem. Often it's a very practical problem. If you schedule your first day of classes on Yom Kippur, that was not the most sensitive thing that you could do, right? So there are things like that you can do. Do you offer kosher meals to students? Not just once a day, but 3 times a day. There are perfectly practical changes that you can make. Do you discipline students who engage in hate? Do you sometimes throw them out of the university? Do you take actions? There are challenges like that you can make to a campus that can make it more acceptable to take advantage of institutions that may indeed have a problem with anti-Semitism. And when you're at those places, to be part of a community of Jews and like-minded people that give you a sense of belonging and affection that helps compensate for the nastiness.
That resonates very deeply. About 2.5 weeks ago, I visited a bunch of our alumni on 12 different college campuses. And some of the places did make a little bit of changes, and other people were told already by their professor that they should drop out of specific classes because they're going to miss the first test, which is scheduled on Yom Kippur. So therefore, they might as well drop out. So you're one little anecdote is real even right now, and hopefully we'll see those changes made. And there's no question about it. Just educating our Nitzavim students that these are practical things that happen, and that you can, as a student or as a parent, you could put pressure, and that will make a difference, not just for yourself, but will make a difference for the entire institution and hopefully for many other people.
I've become completely convinced that higher education cannot be reformed on its own. It needs pressure from parents. It needs pressure from Jewish organizations. It's going to have to come as a multi-function campaign. Don't expect the faculty and the students and the administrators to fix the campus on their own. They're not going to be able to do it.
It's even more important than ever for these students to get involved, for the parents to get involved and try to make change from the bottom up, while people like you are doing things through a professor role and trying to get things changed from the top down. And I just want to share not my perspective, but a perspective that I've been shared with by rabbis about anti-Semitism. He said that the concept of understanding anti-Semitism is mysterious and elusive. If you look at the Jewish texts, or I don't know, by Passover, are you familiar with the passage of Vihi Sha'amda, and on this that it stands, that every single generation, people are going to try to destroy us and to murder us, but yet we are still going to be around, and we will be around. And I happen to be a chazan. I pray for the synagogue that I'm at, but even for a basic understanding of musicality. So usually there's major notes and minor notes, and major notes usually connote jubilation, excitement. Minor notes are usually solemn. The song that is sung for Vihi Sha'amda, this passage, is almost ubiquitous, that many people around the world sing the same song. It goes something like this: Vihi She'amda, that on this which stands, that every generation people want to destroy us and God saves us. And it's sung in a major note. What's so exciting about that? Every generation people want to destroy us and murder us and kill us. That doesn't sound like such a happy song. I know it's something that we should cry about and not be excited about. Yes, true. At the end of the passage, we say that we will be saved. And look at the Jewish people. We're around thousands of years later. So we're still around, but it's not something that we're excited about. I've heard the idea that there is a very unfortunate blessing of anti-Semitism. We don't understand. Anti-Semitism can't be explained. As you said, it's elusive, it's mysterious. I live in Jerusalem. There was a lot of fighting in Israel before 10/7. It was a pretty bad time. I live right near a lot of things that were happening. And sometimes when we, as the Jewish people, don't get along together, sometimes we get reminded by other people about that we should love each other, we should care for each other, and we should always be there for each other. So some of the rabbis do explain that anti-Semitism is a fact of life, and that we can't explain why do people hate us? Why do people cause so many issues? And every once in a while it percolates again. And a lot of times that is around times that us Jews are not getting along and we're blaming each other and we hate each other. And we have to be reminded that we really should love everybody around the world. We should love each other. Hopefully this anti-Semitism goes away. My blessing to all of us is that anti-Semitism dissipates this year, and that you will not be out of a job because you'll come join us in Jerusalem and help us teach at Hebrew University. And we'll give you a whole new job researching why anti-Semitism finally has dissipated. And that should be something that we celebrate together here in Jerusalem, that hopefully the world appreciates everybody, loves everybody, and we're not faced with these challenges of anti-Semitism moving forward.
It's a good message of hope.
I really thank you for your time. I really thank you for all of your work, not just your time now, but all the work that you do on a daily basis for Israel, for the Jewish people, for the world, for Western society. And may God give you the strength to continue doing your work and helping so many people around you.
Thank you for bringing students to Israel. That's God's work.
Thank you. Have a happy Rosh Hashanah, and looking forward to hopefully meeting you on a trip to Champaign in the future.
That'd be great. Shalom.
Shalom, shalom.